Welcome back. So in this second video for Chapter 5 in Industrial Organization, we are going to talk about sort of the long run of perfect competition. And so I think it's important to understand that even perfect competition does not necessarily assume that we're always at the long run equilibrium, right? And so in order to get to the long run, one of our assumptions was that there's, free entry and exit, right, with no large entry or exit costs. And so that's sort of what we'll talk about here. So the participation constraint is basically whether or not firms are going to stay in business or whether they are going to leave, right? And so we said, in our previous example, we had Q star is equal to 1, and our profits then are equal to 1, right? Now, because profits are positive and they are maximized, the firm has an incentive to stay into business, right? But if for whatever reason, right, maybe lots of firms entered, maybe demand fell and profits fell below zero, then we would expect the firm to go out of business and to exit. And so that's what we're going to talk about now. So in our long run equilibrium, we're going to sort of assume that there are three things that happen. One is that the market will clear. Two is that since all firms are profit maximizing, right, and they're all selling homogeneous goods, the equilibrium price will equal the long run marginal cost, right? So P star is equal to MC. Now, one of the things we said, one of our assumptions was that all firms are identical, right? And what we really meant by saying that all firms are identical is that they have identical cost structures. So if you're a firm and you find yourself in perfect competition, then there's nothing you can do to increase your price, right? You're selling the same good as everyone else. There's no way to increase your price. But that doesn't mean that there's no way to increase your profits, right? Because you could decrease your costs. And so a lot of technological innovation comes around by decreasing costs, right? Can you mine that iron ore more cheaply? Can you grow those soybeans more cheaply, right? And all of that really sort of is another side, which we don't talk about too much in industrial organization, right? We tend to focus more on the sort of pricing and quantity and marketing side of things, but it is an important thing to think about. Now, our economic profits then, if when price is equal to marginal cost, will be zero, right? And so that means that if prices are positive, because there's free entry and exit, firms will enter, that will increase the supply, and the price will go down until price equals marginal cost. If profits are negative, right? So price is below marginal cost, some firms will exit. That will decrease industry supply, that will increase the price again until price is equal to marginal cost. So that's sort of where these assumptions come from, right? And so our long run equilibrium then is that our marginal cost and our average cost have to both be the same, right? We said they both have to be P star in the previous video, and there's only one point where they cross, right? So remember, you might have covered this in Principles of Micro, you might not have. When the marginal cost is below the average cost, then the average cost is going down. I always explain it in Principles where, if your last test exam was below your average, then your average comes down, right? Whereas if your last test exam was above your average, then your average goes up. But only at this point, right, where they're the same, that's the minimum of your average cost. And so if our long run equilibrium is where both marginal cost and average cost equal P star, that must be at the minimum of the average cost. Now that's going to be important for our argument that perfect competition in the long run is efficient, right? Because if the industry is producing at this point, then that's the lowest their costs can go, at least from a static perspective, right? Because one of the things we just said was that you could invent new technology to decrease your costs. And of course, that is what firms do. And we want to have incentives for firms to do that. And then we also want other firms to eventually be able to say, oh, their costs are lower, we should do what they're doing. And so just think of this as much more of a static model. But at this point, at P star, where marginal cost is equal to average cost and average cost is at its minimum, that will be our long-run equilibrium where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. All right. Now, let's assume that we have a constant cost case, right? And so with a constant cost case, then there's the cost sort of remains the same no matter how much we produce, right? And if we produce the same amount, then we're going to be at P star. And so our long run equilibrium is sort of fixed at that minimum average cost. And we have a efficient market, right? And so we'll talk about that more in just a minute. Like, what do we mean by efficient? And is that really sort of the goal of everything? Sort of. The key here is right in the kicker box, is that the equilibrium price is determined by technology, meaning the production technology, right? If we have worse technology, then our average cost curve will be higher and the price will be higher. And if we get better technology, then the average cost curve will be lower and our price will be lower. And so that's really an important piece that we don't want to lose sight of, that we want firms to invest in technology and to have an incentive to reduce their costs in order to bring lower prices to the market. So if we have an increase in cost case, so that was sort of just talking about where cost is flat. An increase in cost case gives us our upward sloping supply curve, right? And basically saying that the more we produce, the higher the costs are. And in that case, an increase in industry production leads to an increase in input prices. And we see that, I suppose, in some areas, right, where there's not a lot of technological, movement, or where sort of all the technological movement happened in the past. And so when demand increases and we try to increase supply, then we end up with higher prices. With a lot of manufactured goods, and of course with a lot of digital products, we don't really see an increase in cost curve, at least not in the long run, because technology is increasing, or in the case of digital products, marginal cost is very close to zero. And so we have either a flat cost curve or sometimes even a downward sloping cost curve in the long run. But if we do have an upward sloping cost curve, then our minimum average cost point shifts up and P star increases as we increase production. All right, so we can think about increases in demand. And one of the useful pieces of the perfectly competitive market, frankly, is really just to talk about, well, what happens when something changes, right? Whether it's an increase in demand, a decrease in demand, an increase in supply, or changes in prices in other markets. So here what we have is an increase in demand, right? We have a flat supply curve, and so the price doesn't change, and we just go from Q1 star to Q2 star. So that is our constant cost industry, right? That's what we sort of had before. And you can think of this as really what's going on, at least in the long run, is that because we have a flat, a constant cost industry, we're just going to get more firms producing at this minimum point. When we have an increase in cost industry, right, and demand goes up, then our average cost curve shifts up, right, because the more we produce, the higher the cost is, and that might be because of limits to some natural resource like land or oil or something, or something else, right? And so here then in our industry, we have the upward sloping supply curve, and the increase in demand leads to both increase in quantity and increase in price, which is probably what you saw in like principles of micro. So, but one of the things that will sort of get us to that long run equilibrium is either an increase or a decrease in supply, right? And an increase in supply can come around for a number of different reasons, right? One reason could be an increase in the number of firms, right, which we talked about before. If profits are positive, firms enter until price equals marginal cost again, and we're back to zero economic profits. But of course, we could also get a technological change, right? And remember just that technology in economics just means that we can produce more stuff with fewer or the same number of inputs, right? So it just means that we're getting more efficient at producing. And that then, because of lower costs, leads to an increase in supply, right? Which is just a shift out in our supply curve. And I mean, this is in some ways the most important thing in economics, right? Because it's an increase in our ability to produce. And that means that we can produce more stuff at a lower cost. And that means people can have more stuff at a lower cost. And, from a rich world, 21st century viewpoint, you're like, oh, more stuff, who needs it? But think about what stuff really meant before, right? It was food. It was medicine. It was shelter. It was clothes, right? All the things that people need to survive. And that's allowed us to live, at least in a country like the United States, at a much higher level than people ever could before. So one of the important things to think about is the price elasticity of supply, right? Basically, how quickly does the quantity supplied increase due to a change in price? Now, just going back a step, elasticity, hopefully you've seen the word before. In economics, all it means is a percent change of one thing divided by a percent change of something else. And we like it in economics because it's unit free, right? So it's just percent divided by percent. We don't have to worry about dollars or euros or yen. We don't have to worry about whether we're talking about single units or dozens of units or thousands of units. And so we write it as, usually an epsilon. In this case, we have an S because we're talking about supply elasticity rather than demand elasticity. But really, there are lots and lots of elasticities in economics. And so that's the percent change in quantity supplied divided by the percent change in price, right? And so what this is really a derivative, right? So this is the derivative, the partial derivative of quantity supplied with respect to price times price divided by quantity supplied. So most of the time I'm not going, if we have a supply function, like a cost function, then okay, maybe we're going to use this derivative. But a lot of times, we might just have like a slope and we can figure this out 1 unit at a time, right? So we don't necessarily need to use calculus. But this is the question of, all right, well, how much more do firms make when the price goes up by 1%? We expect it to be positive, right? Or at least, non-negative. Because we have upward sloping supply curves. It could be, it could be that supply would go up infinitely, right? If we have like a horizontal supply curve. And then, it's just limited by demand. And if we have like a vertical supply curve, right? So that, there's no way we can supply more, like the number of seats in a stadium or concert hall. Then it's just zero, right? So the percent change in quantity supplied is zero no matter how much the price goes up. So, but it has to be, above, it has to be non-negative. All right, so we will stop there and we'll do a little bit more sort of in perfect competition in the last video for chapter 5. We'll talk a little bit about comparative statics. We'll talk a little bit about market failure. And what we even sort of mean by market failure, right? Because it's not completely obvious. So we'll talk to you then.